Yes, folks, so much is going on in the world today. Of course, we lost a great leader in the sense of the Supreme Court Justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I know that I was a big fan of hers and was very sad to hear about her loss over this weekend. But now we've got that dilemma of the Supreme Court judge and what will be placed in that position now because, or who will be placed in that position because we do know that already there is talk of trying to put somebody that is a little bit more on the conservative side in that particular office. So a lot of folks are already concerned about that. And of course, we're in the middle of an election season. So a lot of folks are following what is going on with that as well. And of course, there are a number of things happening in the sense of the Black Lives Matter movement and other things that are going on in our community. So definitely there's a lot happening in the world and a lot that people are paying attention to. And of course, this is the International Day of Peace. So we're definitely having a lot of conversations around that as well on IBM.TV. And of course, we've had a number of folks that have been joining from around the globe that have been talking about how important peace is to them and what they are doing to make changes and all of that. So definitely get ready to bring on two amazing guests that I am very glad to have on the show with me. One of them is a fellow board member of mine at the Carolina Theater, that being none other than Dawn Reno Langley. And actually, she's in the process of getting off of the board, but she's now down in the beaches of North Carolina. But definitely have had the pleasure of knowing her for a little bit and getting to know more about her. So definitely looking forward to us continuing this conversation and learning more about her history and about her writing and all of that. And of course, we've also got Simon Tam, who is a master musician and has definitely been doing a lot of great work also. But we'll bring in Dawn first and say hello to Dawn. How are you doing, Dawn? Glad
I'm
to have
doing
you
fine.
join me here on this particular show. It's the radio show with Mark Lee, and they knew that I had that radio background, so they gave me that title for this particular show, and I've definitely enjoyed doing it, having some great guests and all of that. So, like I was saying, I've got to know you through us kind of in that common board experience and all of
hmm
that. But as I was reading some of your books, I didn't realize that one, that you had gotten involved, like myself, in journalism at a very young age. Because it seemed to me that you wrote an article sometime back, and that's actually what got you into the field of journalism. So if you would share that story with our listeners, and then of course I noticed that a lot of your books also are about activist causes. So they have a lot of themes in them that are about activism, and I think that that's very important as well. But I'd love for our listeners to hear that story of how you got into the field of journalism and writing.
Well, I got to say, I've been telling this story wrong for a long time. Um, I used to say that I was 11 years old when I first published my first article, and it was about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I had it added up. My age was right, etc. It was about what would happen to kids if bombs came out of the sky, basically. So I had that in my mind for years until a couple of years ago when I published my last book. I had the book launch in my hometown, which was I always dreamed of doing. I really wanted that hometown support. And one of the people who had helped me organize it was the editor of the newspaper. Her husband had been the editor for years. He died. She took over, and she really thought that it was important to promote local people. So she and I talked, and she came to the launch party, and she had gone through the archives. Now, mind you, this article was written about the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was a long time ago.
Yeah.
When she went through the archives and she found the article, and she said to me, if you had given me the right date, I wouldn't have had a problem. And I said, what do you mean? She said, you were 9 years old, not 11. So I now have a framed copy of that article to remind me how early this all started. But ever since then, there's some things that I really, really care about, and that's what I write about. There's been times in my writing career that certain editors have asked me to write stories that were more in the romance genre or more like that packaged type of book. And I'm not putting down anybody who writes in that genre. I have plenty of friends who do. and I love them and they write wonderfully. But I couldn't do it. I had to write about things that I really cared about from what I hoped was a realistic perspective in an entertaining way so that you like reading the book. So
Yeah, definitely.
started at that 9-year-old article.
9 years old, and that was in Massachusetts, if I remember correctly.
Right, right. I grew up in Everett, which is literally right outside Boston. We used to take the train to the Y when I was a kid, like 9 or 10, 11 years old. So, yeah, it was
Wow.
2 square mile city with 56 to 60,000 residents. It's a lot of people in a very small space.
Yep, sounds like it. And I can relate to that thought of doing something at a very young age because I remember when my brother was born in 1969, and I was born in 62. My brother was actually, yeah, the reason that my mom, as I recall it, did not make it to the opening of the Malcolm X school in Durham, North Carolina, was because she was having my brother. So, like I said, literally, she was supposed to be at the ribbon cutting ceremony, and he decided he wanted to come on that same day as the ribbon cutting ceremony. So I was about 7 during that age. So I was a student at the Malcolm X school at around 7, 8, or 9, and remember writing a lot of things, even some things about race relations and things of that nature. Of course, it being a Malcolm X school, some of the things that I wrote then, I might not necessarily agree with it. I'm sure that my dad will tease me about them because I wrote some very militant things in the framework of race relations and things of that nature. So, like I said, I've grown a lot in some almost close to 60 years. So, definitely, I've had that growth period of not necessarily having those radical thoughts in that way. I mean, there's still some other radical thoughts that I still have and may have even developed greater, but there were definitely some radical thoughts that I had in terms of the way that black and white relationships should be that I might not necessarily agree with now in terms of the way that I wrote them. So definitely that's been a change in my growth and everything. But one of the things I noticed is that a lot of the books that you've written do touch on issues. I know one of them you dealt with the school shooting and things of that nature. Another one you talked about the dolphins, and I know that you're over in the beach right now. So if you
Mhm.
could talk about why it is so important for you to engage in that conversation about things that are you're passionate about, because it seems to me that in addition to being a writer, I would consider you almost an activist as well.
Yeah, I consider myself an activist. I always have. I don't necessarily lead the activity unless I'm voluntold, which happens on a regular basis. But I have always considered myself uh, to be a human. I think we all are. And from the day that I wrote that first essay to this day right now, there are things, like I said, that I care deeply about. One of them is race relations because I've seen the differences between people. I'm not saying that, you're the same as I am and all that stuff because we've had different experiences, obviously. But those types of social injustices just disturb me. They make me wonder, who are we as human beings that we can be like that to fellow human beings or animals like dolphins? I mean, these are sentient beings that know where they're going and can communicate, etc. The same thing with the elephants that I wrote about in the morning parade. I have very strong feelings about animal abuse. Uh, that's putting it mildly, but I think that my role as a writer and as a creative is to bring stories about that kind of injustice to people in a way that will make them understand what's going on, maybe spur them to some action or to at least understand what abuse is. For example, with the elephants, a lot of people didn't realize that for an elephant to be trained for you to ride on them, they have to be abused from the time they're very small. And there's some people out there who are going to say, yeah, well, I can train an elephant without that. No, they're big animals. And in order to train them, they are poked in the eye with hooks. And it's a very painful training period for them. And they were often used for jobs that they shouldn't be doing. For example, they're used for logging in Asian countries. And the reason why they shouldn't be used for that, I mean, they are huge animals and they can pull weight, but their backs are built in a way that you cannot put more than 75 pounds on an elephant's back. Even human beings shouldn't be sitting on an elephant's back because of the way that their bones are built. Anyways, long story short, I talked about this feeling about, wanting to deliver the story to people in a way to get them to understand what's going on, whether it's about PTSD, like in the morning parade, or school shootings or something like that, in a way that is palatable and entertaining for them. But they're still learning something about it. Plus, I think I only have X amount of time on this universe. And if I spend my time writing, which consumes a lot of time, something that I don't care about or that I'm doing just for the money, to me, that's not what it's all about. I'm writing because I care about something that I want to share with other people to hopefully get them to understand that point of view.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I want to bring in Simon Tam to the conversation as well. Simon Tam is a musician who has done a lot of great work in the field of music and has actually even taken on the music industry in some ways as well. So definitely, Simon, if you would talk about the importance of activism and all of that to you and your career. Because like I said, I met you through our mutual friend, Sri Srinivasan, who had you on his show and everything. But I would love to hear more about how important activism to you is as a musician and as an Asian musician even as well. Because like I said, you cover it from a lot of different spectrums and everything. So I would love to hear your thoughts on the importance of activism in the arts.
Well, I think for me, I think it's much like what Don said. We only have so much time. And perhaps as an artist, you only have so much creative force and energy. And why waste it? The world has more than enough pop songs. I realize that. I love pop music, but when it comes to my expression, what I hope to leave on this earth, its legacy, its impact, its change. And if I have an opportunity to create social change through my music as a medium to carry that message, then I consider that a great privilege to be able to do so. So for me, our art and activism are inherently linked. I mean, if you think about it, nearly every activist movement that we've ever had in this country has been tied with the arts. Like art serves as that social mirror for all of us. It serves as the kind of general conscious for our society. But on top of like that reflection that we see, art also provides a window. It's like a gateway into possibility of like what we can be as a country, what we can be as a society, if we choose to fully articulate the values that we claim to have. I mean, there's a lot of things that we see our world for many of us, in particular for this generation and perhaps the one before, like we haven't seen so much unrest and so much upheaval in the environment and politics and everything around us. It's like we need arts to be that arbiter to remind us like, hey, there's something that transcends political divisions and identities. There's something that binds us all together. And that's one of the wonderful and beautiful things about it. It's just this idea of expression.
That's so true. That's so true. When I went to Pakistan, I was there as a Fulbright fellow and talking to women at the university level about the arts and about what creative impacts artists have on education. And I can remember the only day that I had off during that trip was I commandeered the Fulbright fellow and said, please take me someplace where I can listen to your music, see your art, do something that will show me your culture, because I don't really know Pakistani culture. He was so delighted to take me to all the special places that, the kids were going to that day because it was a holiday. So I saw all the kids in the museums and playing a little folk music and saw the special instruments and just got such a richer experience. I wish everybody could have the experience of traveling to a culture that they have not grown up with. It just teaches you so much.
Yes,
Malcolm X, Mark, that's the thing about Malcolm X, that he left a mark on me because he talked about education and he talked about the disparities in education and how that one factor, if that one factor could be leveled and everybody could have the same education, I don't think we'd have the problems that we had. Maybe that would be a simple fix, but I think anyway, so I'm changing the subject here.
No, I appreciate it. And that's one of the things we can do in this. It's one of the things I always am glad to have in the conversations is a wide open conversation with all of us that are involved. So definitely, but Simon, would you share a little bit to the folks that are watching that don't know your story, a little bit about how you got involved in music and about your musical journey? Like I said, Dawn shared about starting as a writer when she was 9 years old. And I know that you probably started also at a very young age. So if you would talk about how you got involved in music and the direction that the music is going in now.
Sure. I think for as long as I can remember, music has been a part of my DNA. Like as a kid, I would just my favorite place was in front of my dad's high fidelity stereo, listening to vinyl records and tuning into the radio, making my own mixtapes of stuff that I heard. And so I actually picked up the bass guitar at age 10. And that's kind of when I just really kind of dove in, fell in love with the instrument. I mean, I took it with me everywhere I went. I fell asleep with it in bed oftentimes. It felt like a really great connection with it. And so I just had a lot of fun. I didn't start performing until, I was in my teenage years. I, like many teenage musicians, joined like a million different bands. But I think the thing that really kind of helped shape me is when I finally started my most recent band, which is an all Asian American dance rock band called The Slants. Like prior to that, I was kind of the token guy in whatever band I played in, but I decided that I just wanted something that was would provide a bold portrayal of my culture, something that I had never really seen. Like if most people can't think of Asian American musicians, like even though there's over 20 million of us in this country, because we're never featured on Rolling Stone, Pitchfork, NPR, and so on. Like I decided, 13, 14 years ago that something needed to change. And so that's why I started my band. And kind of along those lines, I started fusing in activism a little bit more as we went along. Like I didn't kind of set out doing it intentionally. I just wanted to create a band. But I realized that the mere act of starting an all Asian American band is a form of activism in of itself. So from there, I think as we evolved as people, as we evolved and learning like what we can do with our platform, so did my passion for combining those two worlds really kind of deepen.
Yeah, because I'm actually surprised that there aren't more, as you said, Asian bands, because there's such a growing Asian population throughout the United States and everything along those lines. But you're right, except for the ones that are imported in, because I know there's been like a really big K-pop explosion around the United States and everything. But that's folks that are coming from inside, not from outside, not from phrase that right, from outside the country, not from inside the country. So I've actually been surprised by that. And what is the reasoning for that in your mind, Simon? I'm guessing part of it is the nature of the industry, because I'm thinking that the industry isn't as open as it should be. And I would also think the same thing about the book industry as well. So I'd love to hear from you, Simon, and then I'd like to hear from Dawn about how inclusive these industries are. We know that a lot of times they should be, but I don't know that they necessarily are as much as they should. So I'd love to hear from you first, Simon.
Well, I think there's both systemic as well as cultural barriers that exist. So when we think about like racism, it's not just like an idea that someone believes like in burning crosses and like one race being superior than others. Racism is much more complex than that. It's integrated into our history, it's integrated into our culture, and of course into our actual systems. So from a systemic level, it traditionally has excluded kind of dominant racial groups, and in particular Asian Americans, because like I mentioned, most people can't name a single artist. You clearly point out, yes, K-pop has a dominance, but that's kind of a foreign, it's kind of an imported product. Most people don't even see Asian Americans as like American. Like most of the time I walk around with a hyphen attached to my identity. And there's a number of reasons for this. I mean, I remember fairly early when I started this band, we were taking off. We were extremely successful. We were getting radio station play and touring pretty aggressively. And about 2 years in, I had a major record label approach me, and they approached me with a very lucrative multi-million-dollar offer, but it came with a condition. They wanted me to replace our singer with someone who was white because they told me Asian doesn't sell. And it was just, I was floored by it, but they were dangling that promise like right in front of me. Like, isn't this your dream? Wouldn't you love to be able to have your parents retire today? It's like, of course. But, I realized what they were asking was just too much. And I just says, hey, this is racist and this is wrong. And I just ripped it up. I've actually had similar experiences when I shifted from music into the book industry as well. I had numerous editors at publishers kind of had similar, maybe not so overt things, but a number of them would say like, hey, wow, you have such a great story and a platform, but we already have an Asian writer. And I'm like, what does that have to do with anything? Or sometimes they would say, hey, can you remove the stories of your Asian parents and background out of this? Like, I was writing a memoir and I'm like, but this is crucial to my identity. Like you're considering my book about Asian American identity and you want me to remove the Asian American stuff? And they're like, yeah, we don't think people can relate to it. Like Asian people don't read books. And I was like, are you kidding me? It was just all these assumptions that are just rooted in stereotypes. Of course, that comes from our culture. We're creating and upholding these systemic procedures and policies that were inadvertently, had this impact on myself as my identity. I was like, it was kind of ridiculous in that none of these people would say they were racist. They would say like, well, we're just trying to help you. We're trying to help you become as successful as possible. Of course, they would never like outright declare that they were they were doing racist things, but that's exactly what was happening. And so, I think part of that question of like entertainment or book industry or other kinds of industries where we see a large gap in terms of representation, it has to do with both misguided intentions. Like good intentions is not enough. We have to look at the impact. We have to see what is actually happening. And I think that's the part that makes people uncomfortable, because then there's a reckoning like, oh, something about what we built here isn't actually doing what we hoped it would do.
Or isn't representative of the population that it's serving. I think in a lot of respects in the publishing industry, and I can speak about that because I've been in it for a long, long time, the people at the top, the editors, the copy editors, et cetera, are all young females. You know that. And then the people at the top are white males. So you have white males at the top who are saying to everybody, and this is fact, everybody can check this, this is what we want to see in the market. This is what we think is selling. And I think that, when that filters down, it filters down to, we want this, but it translates to secretly, we don't want this. You know what I mean? And it seems to me that there was a systemic, like you said, let's buy white books for white people because that's all that's reading them. And that's not the case. So you're leaving out a huge part of the population, but when it's white people who are accepting the books, editors, copy editors, and up to that person at the top, I don't think they know what to do with them. I really don't. I think there's a lack of cultural understanding. And I'm not saying that everybody that buys a book lacks that, but I think when you have one culture buying a product to sell to that culture, they don't know how to sell it any other way.
And that's one of the things.
It's a racial mess. That's what it becomes, because then you have no understanding, because you have no integration in that editorial level of anybody but white females who are buying books according to what the white males tell them to buy.
Wow.
That's where
And
your problem.
that's one of the things that you even tackled, Simon, because you and your band actually took on a very powerful entity. You took on the U.S. Patent Office and all of that. So, if you would definitely share a little bit about that battle, because you won a battle against a very powerful entity, and a lot of folks may not know that are watching from around the globe about that story. So, if you would share a little bit about how that came about and what was going on with y'all's taking on the U.S. Patent Office.
Sure. So shortly after we started, an attorney actually recommended that we register a trademark for our band name. It's very common. Like most entertainers got to do this if you want major contracts, agreements, and so on. And it just protects our intellectual property rights. Very procedural. What I didn't know that was that this simple procedure would turn into something much bigger than that. And so when we applied to register our band's name, the US government said no. They said, you can't do this because your name is racist to Asian people, even though we're an all Asian band and like by and large, very well supported by the Asian American community. And so, they were basically quoting this old law from the 1940s called Section 2A of the Lanham Act that basically said you can't register trademarks that are considered scandalous, immoral, or disparaging. And the funny thing is that in order for them to use this law against people, to actually reject them on their right, they actually have to find that a substantial composite, so an overwhelming amount of people find it offensive in that community. They never found a single person. They instead quoted urbandictionary.com and other wiki joke websites to support their evidence. And despite my community spending years and years, like thousands and thousands of people standing up, every single Asian American newspaper, blogger, radio show, community leader in the country standing up for us, the government said, that's not good enough. So we took this fight and continued fighting for years and years, and then eventually ended up at the United States Supreme Court, where we won unanimously in this landmark case. And we helped to strike down this old law. And, yeah, that was just one of those things that it's just like, it's funny because a lot of people are kind of worried about like expression, about like, what do we do to guarantee freedom of expression? But does this allow other people to kind of register nefarious things? But it wasn't about that. It was about dignity. It was about saying like, we should have the same rights around our identity as anybody else. Because when we were going through this whole struggle, like we asked the government, we said, hold on a second. If our band name is that bad, like the slant is that bad, and slant is this inherent racial slur, how come you gave it to everybody else? Because there were over 800 other trademarks registered with this word. And the government said, well, it's because you are too Asian to use it. They said it is incontestable that you're of Asian descent and part of an Asian band, and therefore like that's people can't associate your name with anything except for this old outdated racial slur. And that's kind of what happened. Like in the name of fighting against racism, they decided to deny me rights based on my race. And the whole funny thing about all of this is that like if the government really cared about fighting against racism using this law, which I don't think they actually cared about, why didn't they begin by canceling the trademark registrations of the KKK or Stormfront or other actual white supremacist groups? Why did they choose to fight that battle against a band that was doing anti-racism work? It's because they didn't actually care. Like many people, sometimes they wanted to go through the motions and be seen, like perceived as caring, but they didn't want to actually do the hard work of doing that.
Well, and that actually raises an interesting question. I'd love to hear from both of you on this. And that's that whole concept of tokenism, because I know sometimes we'll try to put somebody in, it might be in an organization or whatever, and it's that one Asian person or that one African American person or that one Latin person. And so I find that even in the 21st century, we're seeing too many of even our corporate organizations doing this. So I would love to hear y'all's thoughts on that concept of tokenism, why it's so popular even in the 21st century, and what we can do to eliminate that. Because I think that we need to have diverse organizations, but I don't know that we need to have just one representative of each kind of organization. Kind of like you were talking about, Simon, was like having one Asian band or one Latin band. And we can see that sometimes in our festival work, because I know I've been involved in a number of festivals here in the Durham area. And sometimes, you'll get that one Latin band and then you can't get another one because they've already got the one Latin band. So I just wondered if y'all could talk about that and how we can fight against that.
I can speak to affirmative action, especially with the years that I'm involved with it in the education system, and in my own PhD in social justice. To me, I think that when you, I have two sets of reasoning here. When you put one person in the position of speaking for their whole race, that person's got to feel an incredible sense of, holy shit, what am I going to do if I say something wrong? It's going to be for everybody. I can't represent everybody. That's an incredible amount of pressure to put on someone. Besides the fact that you are not necessarily like the person next to you or the person next to you or the person over here who might look like you. I mean, just because you have the same color skin or the same ethnicity doesn't mean that you're the same as the person next to you or the person next to you. So it's unfair completely. On the other hand, when you have a society that is going to shut the door so completely to certain groups, if you get one person through that door is cracked a little bit, and the next person can come through, and the next person can come through. Sometimes, in my estimation, in the history that I've seen in my life, sometimes that's the only way. Sometimes that's the only way. I mean, I think Jackie Robinson did it for baseball. He cracked that door, let a lot of other people in. There's still racism there, absolutely. But there are more people who look like him through the door because of him. So to me, it always takes that spearhead. It's like the old Roman battering heads to go through those heavy doors. You need somebody really strong at the forefront to make a difference, to open the doors, to be the one who's got the voice sometimes. So like I said, I feel two ways. I think it's very unfair, but sometimes it's the only way if you've got inherent racism.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that sometimes you do need that kind of pioneer, the person to kind of lead the way. And hopefully once they're in the door, it is my hope that organizations, the government, and so on, start looking at it not just as a matter of prioritizing diversity, which is, more like head count, and moving towards inclusivity. Like, don't just have people in the room, have them at the table and make that power equitable so that they actually have a voice, that they're respected, not just because they happen to be fulfilling a requirement or to bring more skin tones and hair types into the room, but because they are absolutely bringing valuable perspective and experience that might not otherwise be there. I think a lot of businesses, the government, they will realize that, hey, the more inclusive you make it, the more equitable you make it, the more that your organization will thrive ideas. And not only do you get more ideas and experiences into the table, but you have potential leaders who could absolutely break us out of these molds that we kind of put ourselves into in terms of perspective.
And maybe help everybody understand someone else's perspective. If you see that, I mean, like, everybody wants the same thing. Everybody wants a roof over their head. They want love. They want family members to stay safe. How much more basic can you get? If you can get that basic, then I think you can deal with just about anything. And maybe I'm being Susie Sunshine here, but I really do think if you get that basic, that's where it starts.
No, then that makes a lot of sense, and I don't know that that's being Susie Sunshine or anything of that nature. But I do sometimes wonder about even how, even within the various divisions that exist, whether that's divisions around gender or divisions around race, we sometimes play into the divisions as well. I know that sometimes, even as an African American, I've run into situations where folks want to still have stereotypes about other minority groups. Like, they may want to try to buy into the stereotypes about Asians, and they might want to buy into the stereotypes about Latin Americans. And I've seen that among the genders as well. Both men trying to buy into the stereotypes about women and vice versa. So I was wondering if both of y'all could talk about that and ways that we can get around trying to break those divisions. Because I've heard some folks say that it's not possible for a minority to be a racist because of their own experiences and things of that nature. And I don't know that I necessarily buy that, because I think that this is the kind of things that we need to have where we're trying to break some of those barriers that have happened. And part of that, I think, is an educational thing, because I don't know, of course, we can name the great African American leaders that have existed, but even they aren't covered the way that they should be. I mean, everybody knows Malcolm X, they know Frederick Douglass, they know Harriet Tubman, but there were a number of other leaders that weren't covered. I hate to tell you this, Simon, and I can name even some great women leaders and everything, but I can't think of a great Asian American leader, if I'm being honest with myself, that I can automatically just say that's the name of a great Asian American leader. I'm sure that if I dig long and hard enough, I might think of some people that are in the business world or in the tech world or things of that nature. But as part of the education system that I went through way back in the 70s in terms of grade school, and the early 80s in terms of college, and even what my nephews are going through. I don't have any kids, but I have nephews. I can't think of anybody that actually knows any of these great leaders that are Asian American. They might know great Asian leaders outside of the country. Like, of course, everybody knows Gandhi, and everybody knows some of the leaders like Nelson Mandela from South Africa, but we don't know enough about even the cultures that exist here in our own society. And I don't know, part of that is that some of these societies, to some degree, are insular. And I know that that does happen. So I just wondering if you could comment on some of those statements that I made, because I do know that sometimes some of these societies can become very insular and very much within themselves. And I don't know that there's enough outreach as well. So I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts on those thoughts.
Yeah, I think things can definitely become insular just because we're kind of presented with so many resources and so much time and energy. And it's presented as if, hey, these are valuable resources and there's not enough to go around. And so, in the world of activism, we call this tactic divide and conquer, that when dominant groups try and get everybody else to kind of fight for the scraps of what's left over. I mean, you think about how we describe certain things in this country, like when we talk about oh, these are minorities. Well, that implies it's, like, for example, a lot of people talk about the 2042, the year that the United States will become a minority majority country. But it only works that way if you consider it as all white people in one category and everybody else in another category. It's much more complex than that. And when you kind of strip away people's identities and their abilities to be seen as individuals, but instead be seen as these kind of racial categories, then it's much easier for stereotypes to thrive and for this kind of scarcity mindset to persist, so that you end up having community groups fight against one another. I mean, earlier you talked about tokenization. I used to do a lot of consulting work for the city of Portland and the state of Oregon. And whenever they talked about granting funds to different neighborhoods and that sort of thing, they kind of called up and they're like, well, we have one representative from the Asian community. Here's one from the Native American community. Here's one, and so on and so forth. But I'm like, hold on a second. It doesn't show you a complete picture of what's happening. Even when you talk about say Asian Americans, just in the state of Oregon alone, that's 90 different spoken languages with their own cultures, histories, peoples, and it's much more diverse than that. When you talk about Native Americans in this country, there's over 500 federally recognized tribes, and there's even more that aren't even recognized by our government. Those groups aren't one monolithic group. So when we start thinking about people, I really encourage people to break it down a bit more and think about individuals, who are they as individual people? What's their story? And when you start thinking about individuals instead of groups of people, you start recognizing the specific nuances that are inherent to that person. And I think that's kind of a great step in overcoming some of the mindsets that drive some of the things you described.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that part of what you were talking about earlier, Mark, was about, people within the same group are kind of doing some infighting. I've been watching the Netflix show Mrs. America, which is about feminism in the 60s and the various women who were part of that landslide victory and Roe v. Wade, et cetera, people like Bella Abzug and Gloria Steinem and Shirley Chisholm, all the greats who represented separate fragments of the feminist community. I mean, I went through that time period, but looking back on it now, I'm thinking, wow, it was really a political framework that kept these women from sharing their ideas together. Their politics were what separated them, basically. And I really believe that sometimes that's what happens in every community. We are, as you said, Simon, individuals. We're not the same as the person next door to us, or even the person who's related to us. Right now, I'm doing a book on DNA and how that affects who we are as people, and how, two people who are born of the same set of parents don't necessarily have the same DNA because of the way it's split. And it's so interesting to me because it just proves that we can put a green patch on everybody and say, everybody with a green patch has the same culture. But that's not the case, because we all have different experiences. Absolutely.
Yeah, we definitely all have different experiences and things of that nature. By the way, I wanted to give a shout out to Tim Sohn, who was watching us from Pennsylvania, and I had actually put that up earlier, and Fernando Celadon, who's a activist out of Los Angeles, California. So they are watching and enjoying our conversation. So definitely wanted to give them a shout out and acknowledge that they were listening to us and everything. Simon, I just wanted to pivot slightly into conversation. We just lost a great leader, and we mentioned that at the beginning, that being Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You actually went in front of that Supreme Court. I think she was probably one of those Supreme Court judges and everything. So I would love to hear your perception of her as a lady. And as Dawn just talked about, we've had some great feminist leaders. I would consider her one of those, but I was just wondering your perception of her as a person, since we just lost her this past weekend.
Sure. Prior to me going to the Supreme Court, I was already a really big fan of Justice Ginsburg. I mean, she had done some incredible landmark things. Many people know her, of course, for her work that, what's funny is she was fighting on a men's rights case, quote unquote, but that kind of paved the way for opening up and dismantling thousands and thousands of laws that discriminated against women. And when that happened, that actually unlocked many legal tactics that dismantled many laws that were dividing people on the basis of race. It's one of those things that, people say a rising tide lifts all boats, where when you help the most marginalized, everybody in society benefits. Well, she was definitely that figurehead. But for me, there was like a really powerful moment. Like when I went to the oral arguments of my case at the Supreme Court in 2017, the first 20 minutes or so, it was just full of justices and the government's attorneys just bickering. Like they were talking about how, my ban was offensive. They were talking about bringing in copyright law and all these other kind of tangential things to test the extremes of the laws. And I just felt so invisible in that moment. Like it didn't matter if I was even there, even though I'd been fighting this thing for 8 years. And it wasn't until about 20 minutes or so in, this little voice pops up, and it's Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she says, wait a second, everybody knows the slants are Asian. They're not doing this to disparage, but to describe and to remove the sting from the word. And I remember I just sat there, like she just cut through all the nonsense, all the bureaucracy, everything else that people were like debating about. And she said, let's get back to common sense. Like laws are about people. It was the first time that I actually had like felt seen. And I just remember thinking like, I'm in love with a Supreme Court justice, like notorious RBG, like throwing it down. And it was like the first time that I actually thought, okay, it's not just me. I really understand how like millions and millions of people could understand through her dissents, through her writings, that when it came down to it, it was about this idea of dignity and being seen. Like it wasn't just about like theoretical applications of the Constitution or law. She found ways to recognize the humanity in people and say like, that's what we need to value. more than anything else. That's why we have constitutional rights, and that's why we have all these laws. Like if we're too busy protecting the law that is unjust, you're ignoring the point of it all. And so I mean, it was quite a legacy. I of course am a huge fan of hers. I mean, I got like her bobblehead and her bronze statue. I have keychains and T-shirts and all that. But more than anything else, I think what I have is this incredible story of like when our paths had crossed, and it's something that I will never forget, because it was the first time anyone in the law, like in the 8 years that I was fighting, and out of all the many courts I'd been through and dozens of legal folks I spoke with, it was the first time that she actually saw our humanity, and I'll never forget that.
Well, Dawn, I'd love to hear
I
your
never will
reflection.
forget that. I can't top that.
You can't top that with Ruth Bader. But there was somebody else that we lost as well, and everything. So we can't top Simon and what Simon's saying. But there was somebody else that we lost not that long ago, and I was just wondering if you could reflect, because I'm thinking about leaders of our generation and everything, and we did lose also John Lewis sometime back. So I was wondering if you could reflect on what you thought of John Lewis. So I'll turn John Lewis over to you, Dawn.
Okay, well, I actually have a John Lewis story. So I actually have a Martin Luther King Sr. story, but we'll save that one for another time. When I was with the National Endowment for the Humanities, went to Mississippi to do a trip through the Delta to be there front and center for civil rights, and to look at the places, like where Emmett Till died, and the whole Delta historical road that went from Jackson to Memphis, to be in the same room where Martin Luther King Jr. was shot. Anyways, John Lewis was there. He came to we had everyday meetings and talks from witnesses who were there during the civil rights period, who were there during Kennedy's voting rights push through Mississippi, one of the few places that didn't vote for either Republican or Democrat. That's one of the few times in history that happened. Anyways, John Lewis spoke to us about Martin, about walking with him, and about being part of the civil rights movement. And it's, to me, he was impressive. He was very statesmanlike and very used to being in front of people. But that particular day, the person who impressed me more than anybody else was a teeny tiny little woman. She must have been 4'5", very thin and very proper. She had white gloves on, and she walked up to the podium to speak to us, and she was telling us her story about being on a farm in Mississippi and knowing when people were going to come to the door and pull them out in the middle of the night because they were caught voting, basically. And she described how the kids would stand in the doorway and watch the dust coming down the road, and how that dust signified that it was time for them to find the hole in the floor and climb under the house so that they wouldn't be taken in the middle of the night. And that story, more than what John Lewis said, and I love John Lewis, really, I think he's an icon, but that story impressed me more during that time period than John. John, I think, is a huge loss for our generation. I know, Mark, he's been part of our generation, and a strong voice that brought people to, I think he threw out a little bit of guilt when he talked to people. It wasn't just, let's all get together. It's let's all get together because you guys are jerks if you don't do so. And I'm not saying that's his words, but you kind of felt that. You felt that, like, this is the right thing to do. When he was speaking, he was talking about not black, white, but the human thing, the right thing to do. Anyway,
I'd love to hear from both of y'all about your thoughts about what's going on now, because of course I mentioned earlier in the show about Black Lives Matter, and it's definitely been a very powerful movement. I would argue a youth-led movement, but it does seem that we have a division, and a very profound division around race and things of that nature. So I was just wondering if both of you could speak to that, because Now I'm actually concerned about this upcoming election because of how it can turn very divisive because of race relations and other things. But I was just wanting to hear from both of you your thoughts on the political environment that we're living in now. So I had Dawn last, so I'll start with you, Simon, then go up to Dawn. So Simon, your thoughts about where we are politically as a nation now, and particularly around race relations.
I think it's a tough time, but it's always been a tough time. When you talk about race relations, since the very, very beginning of this country, it's never been an easy time. So it's not something that communities of color are unfamiliar with. I will say it's an opportunity, though, for change, because it's, I think, the first time we're seeing a even larger pool of people starting to recognize that some of the things that they thought were solved 50 years ago weren't actually solved. What's interesting is if you look at Gallup poll numbers, if when they ask, "Hey, is racism a problem in the United States?" You still find a majority of whites saying no. The same percentage that were saying those same things in 1960, pre-Civil Rights Act. So some people are still living in this shroud of ignorance and kind of denial of what is happening, but it's making it tougher and tougher to do so. The fact that major companies like Nike and FedEx and Airbnb are taking action, not only writing statements, like people write statements all the time. I care about action, but they're actually, refusing to advertise on Facebook. They're pulling funds from, professional sports teams that were using racist mascots. They're actually putting money behind it. We're starting to see the tide turn a bit, and it's thanks to the brave men and women that are marching on the streets who are crying out for the dignity. I know it's a tough time, but I hope it's a time where we can start seeing this, when we look back years from now at this moment, at this election, that the society will recognize that this is a crucial junction where we will choose to stand up for the dignity of others. We choose to stand up for compassion and love. And I think that, anyone who takes issue with the matter of Black Lives Matter, it's I just kind of would appeal to them and think about if someone's going to use the response of all lives matter as a response to it, then if all lives matter, shouldn't Black lives matter as well? Shouldn't the lives being lost at the hands of the state? They're not getting a jury. They're not getting a due process. They're getting executed on the streets, oftentimes unarmed, without even provoking anyone. Doesn't that cry out that there's something wrong with our country? That's not the kind of communities we want to live in. So I would, really implore people to start thinking about how these laws and how society is impacting the most vulnerable, and how we can actually step up and do something about it.
Some of the things that, Simon, you're right on the money throughout the whole thing, but I think a lot of what needs to happen now is that people who look like I do have to go out and educate other people who look like I do about white privilege. I have had a number of conversations with people who don't understand what it's like to walk into a building and be just designated wrong or dangerous or whatever because of how you look, because they never had that experience before. I have family members who are Black. I was married to a Black man. I have grandchildren who are Black. I know what happens to the kids. I know what people have to live with. And I feel that if it's incumbent upon me as an educator and as an activist and a writer to let people know that who look like me, that you have a responsibility to understand exactly what's going on. And if that's the case, if you're getting a step up because of the color of your skin, not only do you need to recognize that, but you need to make sure that it doesn't happen to the next person. I think if we, again, Susie Sunshine, I've been fighting this battle for a long time. I've been on the streets. I've been to a lot of demonstrations. And it seems to me it takes one-on-one to make a difference. You
No.
know, you have to have the tough conversations with people you don't necessarily want to have conversations with. You know, I don't enjoy conversations with people who blanketly accept politician. We can name names, but I'm just going to say a politician who doesn't do anything that is positive for anybody. So yeah, we could
No.
go a big mess here, but I'm not going to.
No, that's all right.
I
We
don't
don't
want to. I
mind.
don't want to speak his name.
That's right. And we try not to speak that name that often. Every once in a while, it will slip out and everything. But definitely, I agree with you. And we need to have those tough conversations that oftentimes are not wanting to be had and everything. Because a lot of times folks are aware of the conversations that need to be had, but then they're afraid to actually delve into them. And I agree that those are conversations that need to be had on a regular basis. Even sometimes the conversations about those divisions that I alluded to earlier, because I know that one of the things that the other side, and I just call it the other side, is very good at is trying to like create division points. I'm thinking about like even within the African American community, you will sometimes hear like the evangelical part of that pitted against the LGBT community because of whatever those moral codes might be that they feel one side might be more that might appeal to them more than others. But I have seen that a number of times where folks will try to divide folks even on those issues that are should be common issues. Because I think we all agree that we want to see a better world, but sometimes folks will find those division points. So I was wondering, Simon, if you could talk about that, because we have seen a rise not just in the BLM movement, but we've also seen a rise sometime back in Me Too, and of course we've seen a rise in the LGBT community. But I do see that sometimes our activists are pitted against each other, and I think that that's the wrong way to have the kind of changes that we would like. So I would love to hear you talk about how we can fight against that attempt to pit us against each other.
I think we should just remind ourselves that, hey, we're all in it together. Like we have, even if our tactics may differ, because when they do, that's when oftentimes other groups are trying to exploit those differences. Remember, like, who are we ultimately trying to serve here? And I like to go with a very basic tenet of philosophy from this guy named John Rawlings. He says the rules that are the most fair are those that we would all agree to, no matter who is in charge. Like, no matter what political party is in charge, no matter what person you might have in mind that you believe is your opposition, whether they are in charge or whether you, like, if you could find rules that you would both agree to, then that is a good starting point. So remember, like, we're all in it together.
There's one rule that is actually common to all religions, and that's love thy brother as thyself, love thy neighbor as thyself, treat somebody else the way you would want to be treated. That is common in all religions. It's said a little bit differently, but that's the one rule that, like you said, Simon, if we all did it, we wouldn't have the problems we have now.
Yeah, and
like we want to be treated.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that. I know Simon said he's got to go to another meeting. I'm hoping to keep you here, Dawn, for another 20 minutes. And then, of course, we've got to go to the rest of the Peace Day celebrations. But, Simon, before you leave, I had two things that I wanted you to hopefully try to address. And I know that it might be difficult to address both of these in a short amount of time. But one of them is I would love to hear from you your thoughts and a reflection. And I'm just going to tell you what some friends have told me. They love the fact of activism and the activism community, but they also sometimes feel that they're left out, that they don't know where the activism is happening until after the fact. So I was wondering if you could talk about ways that folks can stay engaged or get engaged if they don't know where the activism is in their community. Because I've heard people say that they don't even know what the agenda is of, say, the progressive side, and they would like to see a more progressive agenda. So that's the one thing I'd love to hear from you. And like I said, I know that the second question is probably just as long and probably just as difficult, but if you can give me 5 minutes, I would appreciate it. But it is International Day of Peace, so I would love to hear your reflections on what peace means to you. So those are the two questions that I was going to ask about the agenda and how we can get more folks engaged in the agenda and what peace means to you.
Well, for folks looking to get involved, I'm saying just dive right in. Look for an organization that has similar values to you, that you believe represents something that you hold dear, and start showing up. Like sign up on their email list, get notified, and when we have events again, show up at their events when they announce them. That is the best way to get involved, to start signing up. And if you want to get notified in advance, sign people's email lists and actually read their emails. In terms of the International Day of Peace, one thing that I've been thinking a lot lately is this idea of goodness. And I think that's related to peace. That a lot of times folks just assume, they're like, oh, I'm a good person. And I'm like, why? What makes a person good? Or they just say this person's a good person, or this person wants peace. I'm like, a much more interesting idea is to not think of it as a static state. Like goodness, or even the state of peace, is not like an event. It's not a one-time thing. It is a daily practice. Mm. It's much like if you want to be a good person, how do you do that? By being good every single day. It's just like if, you can't say, I took a shower once, I'm a clean person. No, you can't say, I'm not a racist person because, I watch Crazy Rich Asians and I walk down the street in a Black Lives Matter parade, or I have a sign. It's not just a matter of these individual actions. It's the constant striving. It's that journey. It's not a singular event. And so when we think about the International Day of Peace, think, what are you doing today? What is one step you are taking to work towards peace and goodness and bringing justice into not only your life, but the lives of others?
Yeah, we appreciate that. And like I said, I know you've got to go, Simon. If you would share folks how they can reach you and where the band might be playing and things of that nature. So if you've got any upcoming shows and where folks can reach you and learn more about the music that y'all have, then I would love you to do that as well.
Well, we aren't playing anywhere right now, but you can follow me on social at Simon the Tam. And if you're interested in more of my work around justice and nonprofit work, you can go to theslants.org. So thanks so much for having me.
It was definitely a pleasure to have you. Cool. Well, that was a great conversation that we had with Simon, and definitely an amazing person. I'm not going to let you off the hook. You said you got a Martin Luther King Jr. story for me, so I want that Martin Luther King Jr. story.
No, it's Martin Luther King Sr., I said. Martin Luther King Sr. When my first book on Black collectibles came out, I've written 2 of them on African-American collectibles and art, because I was an antiques dealer for a long time and wrote for the newspapers and so forth. When that book came out, Daddy King was the name of Martin Luther King Sr.'s autobiography. That came out at the same time. So I went to a big book fair at the Heinz Auditorium in Boston and took my daughter with me. And I think she was about 8 at that time. And after Daddy King had spoken, he spoke to this enormous group of people, because obviously he was Martin's father. We waited afterwards because I wanted to give him a copy of my book. And I gave him a copy of my book. He took it and he signed his for me. And we walked down the hallway with Martin Luther King Sr., Andrew Young. You know who Andrew Young is, right? And a couple of other people whose name escape me right now, but they were with him and his party. But he walked me down the hallway and wished me the best of luck with my book. I was taller than he was. He's a little guy. He was a little guy, but just so warm and supportive and funny, and a booming ministerial voice. Oh God, you know where Martin got it, because Daddy definitely had that voice. Oh man, it was a really important time for me as a writer, and just to be able to walk down the hallway with somebody of that stature, just I'll never forget it.
Well, another thing that you've done is you've written books about Native American art and your collection of that. So I would love to hear you talk about that as well, because definitely that's a part of our community that doesn't always get enough attention. And I've actually got some Native American blood in my own line as well. So I would love to hear you talk about that book and the importance of that to you as well.
Actually, I have 4 books of Native American art and collectibles and antiques. And I find that world the artisans and the artists in the Native American world is so huge that I could do books from now until the time I die, and I would never cover it all. I would never be an expert. People consider me an expert because I know a little bit about a lot of things. A little bit about rugs, and some about jewelry, and some about Southwestern art, and some about Plains Indian leather, but not a lot about everything, I traveled a lot to do those books. I visited with the artists themselves, and took pictures in their homes and with all their work. We spent days and days. Specifically, most of the pictures were taken in the Southwest and California and the Northwest, because that's where the majority of the work is being done today. There's very little work that's being done by tribes and affiliations on the East Coast. So what's being done is not traditional. It's more modernized version of the old bead work or the old moccasin work. And it's funny, during the years, I got to know through 4 books, there were a lot of artists who were included in more than one book. And one of them was an artist who was based in North Carolina. And she and I, her name is Alyssa Hinton, she and I got to know each other through the books. Yeah. When I moved here, I got a message one day from her saying, "Where are you, and what are you doing, and how's the book writing business, and could you help me with this project?" And I noticed the return address was Durham. And I was like, wait a minute, how did we get to the same place? So we met each other face to face and became great friends. She's moved out to Burlington now, but I have really had the great pleasure of being the person to write introductions to her. I guess you would call it it's a book that she gives in the first day that she's doing a one-person show, and it's a very glossy, special coffee table type of book, and I've written the intro to that book for her. I love her work. She works with all found materials and mostly with fiber, although a lot of it that she's doing right now is work with wood, found material, and very ethereal, strong Native American religious themes to her work, with an undertone of feminism and ecology. I mean, she's just got all of this stuff going on with her work, and I think she's an important artist. I've written a lot of books about Native American art, and I really think that Alyssa is one of the important ones. She's somebody to pay attention to, and she's right here in North Carolina. So
yeah, Alyssa's a great artist. Actually, I have the pleasure of knowing Alyssa as well. I know that my dad, who's an artist, Jim Lee, has done some shows where they have been both on the same show. So definitely I've had the pleasure of meeting her, and she is an amazing artist and all of that. And actually my cousin is actually involved in the powwow movement. So she is actually a dancer out of Holliston, North Carolina. So she's got the Raven Dance Studio, but they travel all over the world, her husband and their kids. So they do the whole powwow circuit. And another cousin actually does some of the clothes design. So like I said, I do have some of that history in my own family as well. But I know whenever I talk to Verna, her and her husband Lonnie are just enjoying going all over the country doing these dances, because I know she's been a fancy dance champion as well as some of the other championship types that they have. And he has also won championships and the kids. So definitely I have great respect for that Native American culture, having cousins that are involved in that and actively involved in all of that. So it's been amazing watching them and seeing what they're doing. Now, Dawn, you're currently at the beach, and we talked about earlier about how important water is to you and the beach. So what is it like at the beach? Are you glad that you've moved to the beach, and what drew you to the beach?
I always have said that I wanted to live on the beach where I can see the ocean and just write. That's always been a dream of mine, just to be, peaceful and to have a space where I can work. Well, I got it. And the reason why is because of COVID, to be honest with you. When something like this happens, it makes you think about life, what you have left of it, and whether or not you done what you want to do and whether or not it's going to be possible in the near future to do what you want to do. And my life I had a number of changes to consider just recently. And I thought, well, if I need to make changes in my life, I might as well be at the beach while I'm doing it. I actually was supposed to be in Paris right now.
Wow.
My partner and I had tickets for a trip to Europe, and we were supposed to be there for a month, the month of September. And that's not going to happen. Obviously, we're not going to be traveling for a long time. But, I think that this time period for all of us across the world has raised an enormous amount of anxiety and stress. Everybody you know is depressed or stressed or at their wits' ends with their kids and with trying to balance work and home and all of that. And I just I needed some peace. I needed a space where I could go on the beach. A friend of mine says everything's better at the beach, and the beach makes everything better. And I know that's probably trite, but it really, really is true. Really.
Wow. And what advice
I
would you
have
give
a lot
to
of writing projects. I am going to be working while I'm here.
I understand that. What advice would you give to others that want to get involved in writing or even activism? Because, like you said, you've done both of those. So, what advice would you give to folks that want to get involved in those? And how would you tell folks to cope if you could give some advice with what's going on with COVID? And I do agree with you that so many people are stressed out and trying to figure out just their day-to-day survival, much less trying to plan out a future and everything.
Right. I think one of the things we have to do is find something good in the situation, whether it's, I've always said that I have to make lemons out of lemonade. I had a trip that I was supposed to go on a couple of years ago, actually, to Morocco with Jackie Shelton Green. And at the last minute, I found out that my passport wasn't going to be okay. I mean, I was literally walking out the door to the airport with my bags. And I said, okay, the next 3 weeks are gone. I just lost something that I planned for the last 6 months, and I put the bags in the car and I went to the beach. I said, the heck with it. I'm making lemonade out of lemons. And I think maybe it's the age I am. I'm trying not to be an ageist here for myself, but maybe it's the situation I'm in. We're all in. I have been striving to find that good thing. On my Facebook page every day, I post good news because I find that when I scroll the rest of Facebook, I end up feeling like somebody's beating me over the head. You feel like you've got a recurrence of PTSD. And we are all, as individuals, responsible for ourselves. And if I don't take myself out of that position, out of the social media, rabbit hole and find something good to focus on, then all I'm going to focus on is the negativity. And that negativity is going to put poison into my bloodstream, and it's going to make me sick, not you, not the person over in that house up the road, not the person in the next country, me. So I guess it's a little bit of, I want to keep myself safe and I want to keep myself level. And I also have an awful lot of work to do and I need peace and quiet to do it. Plus, I think we're all I got cabin fever. I wanted a different thing to look at. I wanted something new.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That sometimes you want something new. It's interesting that you brought up ageism because I've got a dear friend that lives in, they just got a house in Arizona, but they still have their house in Las Vegas. But they talk about that because they come out of the education field and they're oftentimes afraid of where their career is going because as they get older, and they're actually a few years older than me. So I just turned 58 earlier this year. So I think they're like around 60, 61. They're afraid that their opportunities, even though they've got a number of jobs right now, but they're afraid that those opportunities are going to thin out and trying to figure out how they can maintain their career. Because unfortunately, I think the higher ed system is very ageist, is some other parts of our world as well. So I was wondering, as an educator and as one that's been involved as a writer, if you could talk a little bit about ageism and how prevalent it is and what we can do to fight against that, and any advice that you might have to folks that are getting into those years of their 60s or their 70s and still want to stay engaged with the world?
Well, I got 10 years on you, Mark. I'm a little older than you are. Um, I have actually been just dealing with this exact subject because I have a book coming out next year called You Are the Divine Feminine, and it's for women to recognize themselves as strong and divine and, powerful. And I also wanted to talk about spiritual journeys. But out of that particular book came an understanding of the various stages of a woman's life. And the last stage of a woman's life is called a crone, which everybody sees as negative. That's a negative word because when you think of a crone, you think of a witch with a big honky nose and, somebody who's cruel and eats kids for breakfast. That age group is not respected. That age group is made to feel unseen or is punished for being the age they are. They're not respected for the education they may have or the knowledge that they've accumulated through a lifetime. That is not necessarily something that happens in all cultures. That, I think, is particularly American. We really don't respect our age. We don't. We don't see that richness of knowledge as something that should be valued like Africans do, or Europeans do, or Chinese. The parents, the grandparents are kept within the families, and they're protected and they're respected and they're gone to for advice. We don't do that here. And I see that as that's my next ism. Unfortunately, I'm going into it headlong because I am that age and I'm seeing that happen. And I'm seeing being shut down from doing certain things that I'm still quite capable of doing. I could probably walk more miles than a 28-year-old at this point. I don't have to tell you what I do. I see that as an inherent problem because what that does, especially to us, we're baby boomers. You're in the latter part of the group, right there in the middle. We're a huge group. Not only are we a huge group of people, but we vote. We have a vital lifestyle most of the time because we're much healthier than people were a generation or two ago. We live longer, so we have more impact. So that disparity between the respect of the aged and what we actually can offer is going to be, I think, bad for business, to be honest with you. You don't take people who have something to offer and put them in the back closet and expect them to shut up about it. We're not going to shut up. This is not the era that's going to just go quietly into that good night. I have friends who are definitely still out in the streets protesting. But yeah, I think it's a problem that I think is one of the quieter problems. It's the ageism is not something you're going to hear people storm the White House to get rid of. Racism is going to come first. Genderism is going to be a close second. Those people have a much bigger fight than we do. Plus, everybody kind of counts us out. And I hate to tell you, but we're part of those other groups too.
Yep, exactly.
Don't count us out.
Yeah, definitely part of those other groups. Is actually interesting that you said that. I was talking to my mom yesterday, and she was recovering from a minor injury she had. She had hurt her arm and everything, but she was recovering from that. I was checking on her, and she was talking to me about actually raising her new dog because she just got a dog. And I know part of what you do is you go around traveling with your dog. By the way, the dogs' names are very similar because I saw that your dog's name is, I believe, Izzy. My mom's dog is Iggy. So Iggy is running around the house and definitely torturing her because she hasn't had a pet in a number of years. But one of the things she was telling me was that she definitely still has her faculties, definitely is able to think on the ball and everything. And I was telling her just what you said. I said that dad just turned 80. Mom turned in her late 70s. And I was saying, I know some folks that are even a generation below me and maybe even closer to my nephew's generation that probably aren't thinking as sharply as you are. And that's what I told my mom, and she agreed with me. She's saying that, yes, I still have the same faculty, and I knocked on wood that she still had it, but she definitely was glad to still be able to have that. And I know definitely I can say the same thing about my dad and a number of other folks. I even know Miss McLaughlin, who I think is over 100 and still is involved in a lot of things in terms of being able to know both her history as well as share a lot of wisdom. So I would agree with you that we need to have more shared thoughts with our elderly, and I don't know that we do enough of that, either as an author.
Well, one of the things I'm doing right now is I have a new book. This is what I was leading into. I have a new book called Saturday with the Aunties. Aunties. And an auntie in most cultures is somebody who's older and respected, but still cool, and somebody you can go to for, information and for advice, etc. And I found out when I was talking about doing the Crone thing and really delving deep into what Crohn's have to offer, what that age group has to offer to the previous age group, and maybe the advice that they might give to somebody if they knew what kind of thing would you say to your younger self, that type of thing. So I opened it up on Facebook and I talked to my agent about it. She loved the idea. And I'm in my 6th week of questions, I think. I usually have dozens of really long responses to the questions like, what would you tell somebody who's thinking about love, and what kind of things what kind of advice would you give to somebody who's falling in love for the first time? What things should they do, shouldn't they do? And then I talked about one of the things that I didn't know anything about until I got to be much older was how to handle my finances. Basic stuff. Nobody ever taught me about money. Nobody ever taught me about stocks and bonds or what to invest in, or even if I should put my money in a savings account. So I got answers from the people who are responding are male and female, and I'm just saying male and female is a bi-gendered thing. Every color in between. Well, I am opening it up to anyone who considers themselves an auntie. If you are a certain age and you've had nieces and nephews, and you are the person who they might go to for some cool advice about what should I do when this boy, asks me out, or if my mother kicks me out of the house, or stuff like that, what kind of advice would we give to people who are in their 20s? It's been very interesting because it's making the women and men and everybody who's answering the questions, making them consider what they've learned and what they've considered valuable. And the answers are all over the place. I mean, they're really, really good. And some of them are coming from professionals in the field, financial analysts who answered some of the questions and about buying a house. This is stuff that I think is really going to be valuable when I put it together in book form. And I love it because it's highlighting what good stuff old people, I hate that, can offer.
Well, I'm one of those people that don't believe in that, putting people in that old category. I've actually said that I'm going to set a goal that's impossible, and I've actually stated it on this network as other and among friends. But I don't think there's been anybody in the Bible, except for in the Bible, that lived to 200. But I figured I might as well set that goal. Probably not going to happen, but I might as well go for it. So I'm going to go for it as long as I can be able to be able to have intelligent and coherent conversation. Like if I'm going to be stumbling and all of that, then I don't necessarily want to make it to the 200. But definitely, as long as I'm able to still be influencing the conversation, then yeah, I'll go for 200. But like I said, know that that's probably a next to impossible goal. But sometimes you got to set those high goals and all of that. So I'm just going to go ahead and set it, and we'll see what happens. But definitely.
How old was Methuselah? Wasn't he older than 200?
I think he was. I think he might have been like maybe close to 300 or something like that. So he was going there for a while. So I think there were some other characters in both biblical times as well as some of the myths or legends of time that have definitely lived past that. So we'll just see how it goes and what I can do to make that happen, or if it happens. So we'll just see if that is even something that's able to happen in that framework. So it'll be interesting. But the folks that are watching are from around the world. I mean, we definitely had the folks that have commented from around the West Coast and the East Coast, but we do have, actually, it's interesting that you mentioned the auntie, because one of our producers is a gentleman by the name of Ankit, and he's in New Delhi. So he definitely knows about
Yeah.
those aunties and things of that nature. So definitely he can relate to what you're talking about. But when you're getting this advice, is it just folks from the United States, or are you getting it from around the globe?
I have a lot of Pakistani friends because of going there for the Fulbright. So a lot of them have really gotten into it. I have some African friends, some people that I met during my doctoral program. So they're getting into it too. There's a woman from Australia who pops in on a regular basis. Some from the islands. So yeah, they're all over the world. It just depends on who's on. They know that the question is coming now because I've done it, I think I'm in my 6th week. I've done it every week. And they know, and they're starting to get interested. But Mark, you should see the length of their posts. I mean, most people just answer in one word, but they're writing books. I mean, they're taking this seriously, and I'm loving every minute of it. I think it's so much fun, and it's going to be fun to put it all together. My agent's really looking forward to this one.
It sounds like the agent's definitely looking forward to it. By the way, speaking of agents, would you suggest that folks go the independent route if they want to write a book, or would you suggest that they go the agent route? What is your advice to folks that might be wanting to write a book? And I know one of the stories that I've always heard is everybody has at least one book in them. Some people might have, like you, multiple books, but I've heard that everybody has at least one book in them. So if folks want to get that one book out, what would your advice be?
Well, it really depends what your goal is, what you want from it. I coach other writers and I edit other writers in my business, Rewired Creatives. Just took on another client today, actually. And I tell people, I'm honest with you. If you've got a story that is really wide as a spectrum and that's focused so that it's something different than what's out there, and it's well written, and you really, really, really want to be on the bestseller list, then you've got to get the help to make it good enough to get to that agent. However, if it's a story that you want to get out quickly, you don't care about selling millions, then I would strongly suggest going the independent route. But whichever route you go, you have to put out a product that people are going to read. And I think a lot of people think that they can write it like they would a letter to somebody in their family, and that's fine and dandy if that's all you're going to give it to. Have it printed for your family, you can write it whatever way you want. But if you want to put it up for sale, you have to make sure that it's clean, that it's edited well, and it's written well. So yeah, I have 2 answers. It depends on what you need. I have plenty of people that do very well with publishing it themselves because they have a platform. They know their audience. One of my clients is a very well-known cosmetologist who was Mrs. America contest. I think she was Mrs. New Hampshire at one point. But she wanted to tell the stories that she heard behind the beauty salon chair. The people who come in for, various reasons. And there's stories that everybody brings to the chair. That's not something that's necessarily going to be on the bestseller list, unless those stories are coming from somebody who's famous or they're so well told that everybody's going to relate to them. She wanted them out, and she had a very good platform. I think that her marketing and publicity is probably better than a lot of other writers that I've seen who were professional. So I said, you can go the route of getting it to an agent, but you're going to have to make sure that you've got something that's really much better than anything else out there. Or we can get it as good as we can make it working together, and you can publish it yourself. And then you can take it wherever you want to take it. Plus, if you really want to get technical about it, you make more money if you sell them yourself. But on the other hand, you don't get the distribution you would get if you sell them yourself. You would get better distribution and into bookstores if you go the traditional route with an agent. That's a very long and convoluted answer to you.
No, I think you definitely answered the question. Other thing I'm just kind of curious about, and we're getting ready to wind everything down very shortly, is for those folks that want to write about things that they're passionate about but are also activists about, do you ever have any fears about that? Because a lot of the things that you write about are also hot button issues. I mean, like I said, we talked earlier about how you wrote about the the gun shootings, the school shootings. You've definitely written about the torture of animals and things of that nature. So those can be, and I'm sure some of the books deal with climate change. So those can be hot button issues. Are you ever concerned as a writer that you might be alienating some of your audience because those are such hot button issues? Or is it, as I'm probably guessing, that you're so passionate about them that you're going to write about them and you don't mind losing a few of those audience members?
I think my audience wants to hear about those issues. I think that's the audience I have. I think if you want a happy-go-lucky romance, you're not going to read my books. I mean, there are very few people that have read The Morning Parade who didn't cry because of it. So I might, there are certain people who won't read it because they know what the subject matter is. And that's fine. You know, there are a million different kinds of books. There are millions of books published every single day. And I'm not kidding. That's the statistics, in the millions. And I don't think that, you know, everybody reads the same thing. I mean, I don't read the same thing all the time. And I'm certainly, there are certain categories that I've never read. I have never read a cozy mystery, and I don't intend to. Or, you know, some of the books that just, subject matter doesn't appeal to me. So I think that there's a certain audience that will come to my books and read them because they're about social justice issues. And there's a lot of people who will say, don't want to read about elephants who are being abused, or I don't want to read about the dolphin trade, or I don't want to read about transgender human beings. So I'm not going to read Don Reno Langley's books, and that's fine. That's okay. That's okay.
Definitely. And like I said, there's a lot of folks that need those stories told and everything. Because like you said, you've also in one of your books dealt with the issue of transgender and the LGBT community. And there are a number of folks that are afraid to tackle those issues in their literary reading, much less writing about it. So what was it like going through that experience and writing that book? Like I said, that was another topic that you dealt with that a lot of folks might not be wanting to tackle. So how did you go about doing the research when you wrote the book that had the transgender characters?
That book that came out of my PhD dissertation. That was a novel that I wrote in conjunction with the critical thesis that I wrote on transgender individuals. That came out of my MFA program, where I wrote about women writers in their journals and what the difference was between their public writings and their private writings. When I went into my PhD programs, I wanted to know about transgender authors and whether they wrote about different subjects or had different voices pre and post transition. It required me to do an awful lot of research and to conquer some of my own misconceptions about gender and about sex and about choice. It taught me a lot. I have a lot of trans friends, and I really respect. I just got a fly ran into my face. I respect the struggles that they have gone through their whole lives. Anyways, it's something that I don't think that any of us as writers get away with writing a book without doing a lot of research and without, you know, what you see in between the covers of my books is 10% of the research that I've done. I've done 90% more. It's like the old iceberg thing. I know much more about that topic than I ever put within the pages of the books. And I feel that that's necessary. I mean, when I went through my PhD program, one of the questions that they asked me when they interviewed me about being part of the program was, you know, what is it that you really care about? What is it that you're passionate about? And I'm passionate about anything that puts another race, sex, animal at risk.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And a lot of times folks don't even think about even like the identity of authors and people until after the fact. I'm thinking about the great Pauli Murray and how a lot of people started thinking about even what her identity was, but it was well after she had passed that folks even decided to explore that identity. And some folks have even criticized as to whether certain communities should have outed her or not outed her after the
Mhm.
fact, after she get passed. So I've heard folks that have had that conversation as to whether she was part of the LGBT community or not. So like I said, that's something that we'll probably never know because like I said, she's gone on and everything, and folks can only guess and speculate. But I do know that that does happen sometimes after the authors have passed on, and folks want to try to put them in some kind of context. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about how we sometimes try to even contextualize our authors after the fact. I mean, definitely there were authors like James Baldwin who was very adamant and open about what his life was, but there were others like Paulie Murray that might not have been as open, and then folks would do the research afterwards. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are when we try to contextualize people in the framework of their literature and their history.
I think we're having this conversation in the publishing world today, and it's our own. It's called Own Voices. That's the Twitter hashtag, and it's about who has the right to write the story about a particular person. Does the person who writes the story have to have the same experience as the character? Um, it makes it very difficult as a writer, because one of the things we have as writers, as creative people, is imagination. So we can go into that person's world and we create worlds for everybody else. Now, back to the question about Polly and about other people who have passed and we might consider what their life was like. I think one of the things that readers do when they think about authors is they project that the story that they're reading was actually a story that the author went through. So I'm looking at the Own Voices argument that people should write their own stories. Koreans should write their own stories. Americans should write their own stories. Women, men, blah, blah, blah. But I also think it cuts us off at the knees because we also, as writers and as artists, have imaginations. And without that imagination, we can't explore other lives besides our own. However, if you don't do that homework, then you shouldn't be writing it. I also think that, it's wrong. And I tell people this all the time. Poets get it all the time, much more so than novelists or short story writers. Poets are it's always expected that the narrator of the poet is the poet. And that's not the case. But it's really kind of difficult for an audience to tear the two of them apart when the poet is there on the stage saying those words about pain and heartache and so forth, when they're actually maybe embodying somebody else. Right. It's harder for them to separate it. But I think a lot of people also figure the same about writers. They think whatever we write about is a situation that we went through or an experience that we had. And that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes it is. Sometimes we steal from our lives, but that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, that's very true. And I'm going to wrap everything up, like I said, and everything. But before we leave, I would love, as I did with Simon, if you could share with folks how they can reach you, where they can find your work at, and if you've got any newer projects that you want to share with them as well. You've alluded to some of them, but if you want to expand on that. And then, of course, I would love to hear your thoughts on peace and what peace means to you as well. So like I said, I kind of have a close out with Simon. So I'm going to turn it over to you in that same kind of way.
All right. I'm on, I have a couple of websites, dawnrenolangley.net for all of my books. The Morning Parade has its own website. And Rewired Creatives, which is my editing and coaching, is rewiredcreatives.com. I am, like I said, working on the new book on the aunties. Plus, I have right in front of me a novel that I'm revising for my agent, which is about DNA and following the DNA in your life, basically. And I have a couple of other projects that are in the back. In fact, you can see behind me my bulletin. I'm
Yeah.
going the wrong way. It's underneath the clock. It's got pictures of my new characters from the new novel. So that's kind of my inspiration for moving forward with what I'm supposed to create while I'm at the beach. So that's what I got going on. That's how to contact me. And as far as the International Day of Peace, I'm a Buddhist, and we've always celebrated this day. In fact, we celebrate peace a lot, and try to get like an underhum of meditation going to lift up everybody else who might be feeling down. I think this particular International Day of Peace is incredibly important because I'm just going to talk about our country. The rest of the world can be by itself right now, but our country's in a particularly divisive place. I don't think I've ever seen it like this before, and I saw some pretty divisive things in the 60s. But this is a place where I don't want to be. I think a lot of other people don't either for many reasons. And I think this day of peace should be to sit with yourself, to meditate, to think about maybe one thing that you might be able to offer to someone else that would be a peaceful gesture. I don't know what it might be. I think everybody has a different idea on that, but that's how I would celebrate the Day of Peace, besides doing a lot of meditation.
Yeah, sounds like a great way to celebrate the International Day of Peace. I was actually just thinking as you were talking about that. I had the pleasure yesterday of watching one of the basketball games, and afterwards they were re-airing one of the sports things that the arena does, and they had that woman that does the brown eyes experiment on, and she was basically saying that maybe we need to even break away from the whole concept of race because race is so much of a man-made constraint and everything
Right.
was what she was arguing. And as I heard her say that, I was thinking that she may have some very valid points in that argument because she was talking about how she was the one that did that experiment many years ago in her classroom where she divided these folks and folks that were at one time very smart. When they got the wrong colored eyes, their sense of intelligence went down, and vice
Mhm.
versa. Some folks that were not all that bright in the world of education or perceived that way, then when they got the quote unquote right colored eyes, then they had a better attitude and everything. So I was just wondering, as one that has done research in DNA, what are your thoughts about that? Because I am sometimes concerned about DNA because I sometimes wonder if, and this is just tell you my concern about it. I don't know what your research has found, but a lot of the DNA places that do the DNA testing, unfortunately or fortunately, and think in my mind, I'm saying unfortunately, are based in European countries. So I think that the base sample automatically makes that more of a European kind of bias. So that's just one of my fears. But I don't know if you found something similar in research, since we know that the part of the civilization was in Africa. So I don't know because it seems to me everybody's got some African American in their blood, but because of where the DNA is coming at and the research is coming from, I'm wondering if that's also getting us to have a lot of folks identifying that they have European blood, even if they don't. So that's just a fear of mine. But I was wondering if you found some similar thoughts when you were doing this research.
I I don't know about the finding European or African blood. I'm not sure about that, Mark. But I do know that what happens with DNA research is that as people, I mean, when they first started doing these tests, when they first started doing uh, Ancestry.com or 23andMe, they had a small pot of DNA to compare to. So you might have been compared to 25,000 other people, some of whom may have made connections with you somewhere along the line, but most don't. But as more people put their DNA into the pot grows, and you're able to find links that you wouldn't have found elsewhere, or you wouldn't have found before because there weren't people in that pot who had the DNA who could make the links with you.
Yeah.
As it goes, it's going to get bigger and bigger, and you're going to be able to find more of those links. Now, just knowing, you know, history and the movement of people and, you know, tribal natures, etc., you are going to have people who moved from one country to another over an ocean. I mean, I was told the whole time I was growing up that I was Swedish. completely nonstop, no other, heritage. My mother didn't know her mother's background. Come to find out, I'm not Swedish. I'm 3% Swedish, 76% English. Now, when you think about that, you think about the movement of the European people. The Romans actually built the roads in England. So if I really traced things back much further than I'm able to right now, I probably have some Italian back there. Because if I am English, somewhere along the line, the Roman armies came through and impregnated a lot of English women. And that race, kind of crisscrossed. And you find things that you didn't expect to find. Now, my ex-husband did it. He did, I don't remember whether he did Ancestry or what, but I talked him into doing it. And he said that he found that most of his ancestry came from Western Africa, because obviously that's where most of the slave trade was. He thought his whole life that he had Native American in him. He comes from Texas, and his grandmother told him stories about, she had Native American blood, blah, blah, blah. Well, he never got that in his DNA report. Why? Maybe members of her family have not contributed to the pool, so that link is missing. Or maybe she had stories about being Native American, but she never was, just like I was never Swedish. Come to find out, my grandmother's family, they came from the Swedish port in Sweden, but my grandmother's mother was actually from Denmark, and my grandmother's father was actually from Norway. So somehow they got to the Swedish port, where they changed their name because there were too many Johnsons on the boat going to America. So they changed it to Alberg.
Well,
so
right.
Reports get changed along the way, and you can just go back so far with ship reports and birth certificates and death certificates. Then you have to rely on blood and DNA.
Yep, and a lot of times the stories are also interesting because it's interesting that you said that, because I know that one of my cousins, as I said, both me and my younger brother primarily identify as African American, but I have cousins that only identify, or I guess I should say primary, because they may acknowledge other parts of their ancestry as well, but they primarily identify as Native American. So like I said, that's just within one family structure, and a part of that is because of the stories that they were told and the ways that they decided to go with the narrative, whatever that narrative was. So a lot of times it's based on those narratives. And I know that sometimes even after folks find out things within the narrative, they don't always change it. Like I said, I know that there's definitely European American blood in my family line. I know my aunt who has done that, thinks she did Ancestry, one of those Ancestry ones, or 23andMe, and she's actually found some Irish blood. And we have no idea where the Irish blood is coming from on my mom's side, because that's my mom's sister. But like I said, they've definitely found the different other bloods that exist. So definitely, we know that we are all mixed individuals. Most of us. I know there are very few, if any, purebreds of anything, despite what some of the very racist elements of society might want to think. But we are all basically blended folks, and we probably need to, in that sense of celebration of International Peace Day, we probably just all need to think of ourselves as part of the human race and not necessarily part of the other kind of things that are going on. Because if we think of ourselves as part of the human race, then we can celebrate cultures. Because I'm not against celebrating cultures. Because like I said, my cousins that are very much into that Native American culture definitely enjoy going to the powwows and celebrating that. I know I enjoy going to some of the Kwanzaa celebrations that Baba Chuck was part of that come out of the African American community. So I don't think that just because you celebrate yourself as part of the human race, that you have to discount whatever your heritage is, whether that's Irish, whether that's African American, whether that's whatever. So I think that that's one of the things that I try to get folks to understand, is that we can celebrate our heritage, but also one of the things that I think you've done a great job of is you can also go to other parts of the world and celebrate their cultures. That's one of the things I have not done enough of, is I haven't done enough international travel. I've been to Turkey when I was a baby, and I just recently, about 2.5 years ago, went to on a cruise. So the cruise took me to Puerto Rico, the Grand Turks, and places like that. But that's pretty much the extent of my international travel. But I also love going to international events like we have here in Durham and around the other parts. So even if I don't go to Poland, I can go to Poland through the events that might happen or the international festivals and things of that nature. And I, because of COVID, can't travel as much as I want to. Hopefully, and because of finances, but hopefully the finances will improve and hopefully I'll be able to do more international travel. But until that time, I can pick up one of your books and go to a place that I haven't been to by going to the book.
I got to say that my mother never traveled. My mother didn't know how to drive a car, but she was the one who kind of gave me the permission to do whatever I wanted to do and to be okay. She used to, when I asked her when I was a kid where I came from and what my nationality was, she said, "You're Heinz 57." I said, "What's that?" "Well, you're a little bit of this, a little bit of that. You're like a mongrel." And I am a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But as a kid, I would say to her, "Well, am I Chinese?" And she would say yes. "Am I African?" And she would say yes. "Am I Canadian?" She would say yes. It didn't matter what I said. She would say yes. And I think she did me a huge favor because she never said, "You are only this." I knew my heritage because my grandparents told me about it, but she never said, "That's all you are." She said, "You are a little bit of the world." So when I started traveling, I think she really enjoyed watching what I was doing because she never did it herself. But she was the one who literally taught me about not being racist.
Yep, and that's a great lesson that she gave you. I know my grandmother was a librarian, and I don't know how much world traveling she did. She traveled around the United States and did some great things, including creating the first African American library in Raleigh. But I don't know how much world travel she did, if any. But she definitely was very much engaged because she was a librarian, so she understood the importance of books and was friends with a lot of folks like Zora Neale Hurston and Pauli Murray and a number of others. So she knew those folks in her life as part of her peer group. So I would agree with you that that's very important. And one of the things I was going to share with you is that on another show that I watch, it's not part of the IBM TV family, but my friend Sri Nivasan, who I mentioned earlier, is how I met Simon. And he does like some shows around COVID talks and other things through the Digimentors group. But one of his producers, Neil Perrick, has an interracial child. They have their daughter Emily, and that's basically what the way you described yourself is how she's growing up. And I think she's like under 10 or something like that. But her parents are he's of Indian descent, like from India. I think his wife is one of the European nations, and she might have some other things mixed in there, but they put those all in there. So they say that she is, and I might be mixing what they actually are, but just for example, they might say that Emily is Swedish, Irish, Indian, and a Yankees fan because he's a diehard sports fan. So they had to add that that's part of the identity as well.
That's great. I love that. I love that. It's perfect.
Cool. Well, once again, Dawn, my friend through the board at the Carolina Theater, and I know that you're in the process. Of course, we're going through that process of finding new leadership, but other than that, you're in the process of getting off of the board, and I've still got a little ways to go, but I know you will still be engaging with me and others there at the Carolina Theater. And like I told you before, I got to find some way to sneak down to the beach and spend some time visiting you and your folks down there. But definitely, I was glad to have this conversation with both you and Simon Tam. So Dawn Reno Langley and Simon Tam have been our guests today. An amazing author, an amazing musician, and I want to thank you for joining us in this conversation and for sharing your wisdom. And I definitely look forward to seeing you soon. As a matter of fact, I think we might see each other tomorrow because I think we've got to interview somebody tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Mark. I've had a blast. It's been great. It's been thoughtful. And Simon, I wish I could thank you in person, but it's been wonderful. It's been fun.
Thank you. And I will definitely pass that word on to Simon that you enjoyed that. And hopefully through the wonders of the World Wide Web, y'all can connect, or I can connect the two of y'all, because that is one of the things that we like to do here. I will tell you that the network itself is planning to do a book show of some sort. So when that is put into place, I may have them reach out to you to both share your own wisdom as an author, and who knows, they might even have you come in and possibly even host some of the book shows whenever that is created. But I do know that they have a goal of getting, like, I think there's over 50 shows, somewhere around 52 or 53, and they have a goal of getting to 100. So they do know that that is going to be coming their way. And one of those shows that they have talked about is a show about authors and books. So just know that IBM.TV is planning to do that, and I will definitely put them in touch with you as well as some other authors that I know.
Great. Thank you for that. Terrific. I look forward to it.
Sounds great. So I'm going to put on the intro outro theme, and then that will get us on out of here. And I do appreciate once again Dawn Reno Langley and Simon Tam for joining us in this very delightful and very interesting conversation where we talked about a lot of issues and definitely covered and dwelled into a lot that is going on in this world right now. Of course, I've got to get ready to pop onto the other World Peace show that they're doing and engage with some of our other guests, but definitely have enjoyed having these two amazing guests on the radio show with Mark Lee that airs on TV. So definitely appreciate y'all joining us. And right now we're going to put on the intro, outro, and get on out of here.